Hi everybody, welcome to the Upod podcast. We're going to talk about true crime today, and we have a special case. It's the Hillside Stranglers, and we're going to start off with like a little bit about them and their background. So it's two cousins, and they're from New York. I think it's like the Bronx or something like that. And they had a pretty rough childhood. I think one of them was adopted. It was the main guy. What was his name?
Kenneth?
Yeah, Kenneth.
Bianchi.
Yeah, Kenneth Bianchi. And he was adopted into his cousin's family of like, what's the other guy's name? Angelo. Yeah, the names are weird. And they moved to LA, and Angelo has an upholstering company, I'm pretty sure. And they get pretty bored with their jobs, and they pretty much don't want to work. So they start making like a pimping company. They want to pimp out some girls to make some easy money. And they get two girls, and I think they get pretty bored of them, and they start abusing them. And
so just right off the bat, obviously great upstanding citizens.
pretty much.
Yeah.
And the first murder was October 18th, 1977, and the body was a young woman. And they found her on the side of a freeway, just on the side of the freeway, and they like observed her, and her name was Yolanda Washington. That was the very first victim. And she had like marks. Yeah. She had Washington. She had some marks on her wrists, neck, like she was bound up. And they found out she'd been raped, and she was cleaned, so like they knew it was a murder. Like, you're not just gonna die and have marks and be clean. Like, that's weird. So they immediately knew it was like murder, and it was on purpose. And that was the first victim. And then they also found out she was a sex worker. So like at the time, a lot of people did not care, because in LA at the time, and like still now, like people don't really pay attention if like a sex worker gets murdered or like a homeless person gets murdered. They care,
which is horrible.
That's something that like a lot of murderers have in common. Like they take advantage of like
people who don't have a place for themselves. People.
Well, it was really interesting. I did a lot of my research about Washington State and stuff like that, and that's what they said, that they selected their last two victims, or Kenneth's last two victims, because he thought nobody was going to notice, which was way different than starting out with a sex worker who, might not have as many connections as these two college kids did.
Yeah. And like I feel like that just encourages them to murder more when nobody notices, like when a sex worker is murdered. And like if you pay attention to that, then I feel like they could be stopped sooner. But anyway, then the second victim was found, they found her just in the neighborhood, like in a suburb. It was a couple miles away, and she was in somebody's driveway, just laying there, dead. And she was naked, and everybody was wondering, like, how did this girl just get here? Like, and so, like, they looked at the evidence, and it looked like she'd been, like, thrown out of a van. And that's when they knew it was, like, most likely two men, because, like, how could just one guy drive and throw a woman out of a car? Like, can't do two things at the same time like that.
You have to be really strong.
Yeah, and like I don't know, you push him out. I don't think
Superman.
so. And then they connected them because she had the same exact markings, and like she'd been raped, just everything like that. And her name was Judith Lynn Miller, and some background about her was she was also kind of like an outcast, kind of like the other one. She was like a dropout of high school, and she started started like prostitution and stuff like that. So she's also like an easy target in a way.
And wasn't she like 15? Like I came across that. Like she was
she?
really
Yeah, she
young.
was like a high school dropout.
Wow.
She was really young.
Yeah.
But she might have had like some drug use, but I don't think that was like super mentioned, as like the other ones weren't. And then they were like interviewing people about Judith, who was the second victim, and they said that they saw her get into like a two-tone van, and that was like a big deal. That was like the only evidence they had, was like a two-tone van in the 70s. Like there's gonna be a million of those.
The 70s, they had really weird cars
Mhm.
everywhere.
And then they found a third victim, and that was a couple weeks later. It wasn't much far after. And she was, like, kind of prominent in the community. Not, like, super prominent, but she was found near a country club. So that was, like, way different. She had no background of, like, drug use or prostitution, and she was in her early 20s. Like, she was way different than the other victims. So that's when the case started to be, like, picked up by the public, because, like, before it was just, like, sex workers, drug addicts, high school dropouts, so nobody really cared. And then the public started, like, getting more interested because it was, like, a young girl that most people would see on the street and, like, know and think, like, that's a good girl. And then they realized, like, obviously the killer targets women, and, like, they have a hatred towards women, and they're just really violent at nature. And let's see, that's when, like, the urgency was increased.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next victim, her name was, this is, like, a part where, like, when the public started taking interest, more people came out with, like, stories that are, like, weird that's happened to them recently. And there's one girl, her name was Catherine Laurie Baker, and she was, like, a daughter of a famous actress who'd, like, recently passed away. And she told this story to the police where these guys in, like, a two-tone van came up to her, and they pretended to be, like, police officers, and they were, like, really urgent. They're like, we're undercover police officers, and you need to come with us right now. You're under investigation, or something like that. And she was, like, really curious. She was like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm just walking down the street, and you're trying to arrest me. And then they see the picture of her and her father, who's, like, a really famous actor in LA at the time. And they immediately backed off because they didn't want to pick on somebody who had, like, that much attention around them. So, like, if somebody like that died in LA, people would really notice, and the, like, more interest would pick up in the case. But she didn't think much of it until, like, all those other girls started getting murdered, and they're like, well, maybe this has something to do with the case. So she went with, she told that to the police, but, like, that really wasn't important until, like, later on, like, after, like, when they went to Washington, and they, like, figured more stuff out. It was just a story. And then the 4th, 5th, and 6th body were found, and the 4th was just, I think she was on the side of the road. And then the 5th and 6th were, like, 2 young girls, like, really young, like 12, 13, something like that.
Yeah, one was 12 and the other was 14.
Yeah, and they were found in a park, like, decomposing. It had been, like, a long time, too.
No, I believe it was on a hill, like, on a hillside.
And it was, like, a 9-year-old boy who found their bodies, too.
Yeah. They said, like, it was a 9-year-old boy. It said, like, it looked like a mannequin, and then they were just propped up, and that's terrible to find. That would be horrible. And this kept happening. Like, they found bodies, like, weekly. And the same day they found those 2 girls, they found another girl who was in college, and she, like, didn't have history of drug use or prostitution or anything like that. She was just a normal college student who, like, got good grades, was just a pillar in, like, the community. Like, everybody would think she's, like, a good, kind girl, like, nobody with issues or anything. And then after that, I think the murder started dying down, because around LA, at least, because the guy
Kenneth,
he was he tried to get a job with the police station, and he would go on ride-alongs and stuff like that, and the police would look at more evidence, and he finally became, like, a person of interest. And so they looked at him, they interviewed him a little bit, but, like, nothing came of it. And Kenneth told Angelo, and that started a big fight, and that was a big blow up. And so Kenneth moved to Washington, and the murders kind of died down, and that's when it goes to Washington.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the method that they used. So it's pretty similar. All their victims were women, of course, and they were all strangled. That's how I got the strangler's name in there. They all showed signs of sexual assault and torture. There's some other interesting details. One of the girls was injected with Windex and had a piece of, like, a stove, it's like glass pipe in her mouth, and a plastic bag tied over her head. And then another one of the victims had burn marks on her palms, and she was abducted just across the street from her family's house. And her parents saw her car door hanging open, and when they got up the next morning, a neighbor told police she heard someone cry, "You won't get away with this." And that night, when she looked outside, she saw 2 men. And then the woman also told detectives, when pressed about why she didn't call the police when she saw that happen, she herself was a victim of rape and had been paralyzed with fear. The memories came flooding back, which is also pretty tragic. So, like we were saying, there's a lot of less carnage in the next 3 months and no new murders to begin in 1978. And a lot of detectives thought that the killing spree was over, thankfully, until more were found.
In Washington. Dun dun dun. Okay, so Mr. How do we decide to say his last name? Bianchi.
Yeah.
Kenneth Bianchi decides that he's done with LA and he goes to Washington. Like genius he is. But of course, like everybody has their addictions, whether that be drugs or ice cream. His was murder. Wonderful.
He's
hard
different.
habits. Just a hard habit to break, you know? So decides that he just doesn't want to be a civilized human being and he wants to revert back to his ways, but this time without Angelo. So, what does he do? He decides to go to college and find these 2 girls who he's been scouting out, and he thinks they don't have a lot of friends. The only person that they know are like each other. He doesn't see them connecting with people in like their lives. So he's thinking, nobody's going to miss these girls. Who would miss them? Horrible thing to think, because you know what? We don't miss you. And he unfortunately decides to murder them. And like the dum-dum he is, people did notice that those girls went missing and he did get caught. And with that, all of the other murders started connecting because there were similarities in these killings with the ones that happened in LA. And so everything started connecting, and of course, instead of being a man and I guess admitting his wrongdoings, because you know how some killers, they like to admit, they're like, yes, I did that, that, and that, because they want the fame. He was the exact opposite. He was like, it wasn't me. You know what? I'm actually insane. I have multiple like personality disorder. I have DID, I believe it's called, dissociative identity disorder. It's like, it wasn't me. It was my alternates. And he was put through, I guess, like many psychological tests and obviously proven wrong. Like he does not have that. And of course, just to make the pot even thicker, he just goes and throws his own cousin under the bus because he doesn't want to die. And they both ended up, Angelo got life in prison without parole and unfortunately died in 2002, I believe, of cancer, or was a heart attack.
I think it was a heart attack.
Yeah, I think it was a heart attack. And Mr. Bianchi is still serving his time, but has multiple life sentences. So, Ella, would you like to conclude this?
Sure. So after Kenneth Bianchi was arrested, a lot of the morticians started to see, like Gabi and Hallie talked about, they were binded, they were sexually assaulted, and in the end, that coupled with the witness statements of the van, of the lady who was interviewed. I was going to say was charged. She was not charged. She was just interviewed. Of the woman who was interviewed, that was ultimately what led to Bianchi being convicted. And then, like Victoria said, he was trying to claim insanity and then eventually threw Angelo under the bus to avoid capital punishment because he was up for execution.
I don't think he wanted that life sentence.
No, yeah.
He got it anyway, pretty much.
Yeah. What I think is really interesting to watch, if you watch kind of shows that aren't necessarily true crime but are based off of true crime, like they always talk about the escalation of murders or the victim type, and in this case that was completely true. Like they started out with being pimps and with prostitutes, and then escalated to college kids, and Victoria, said that they might not have been connected with the community, but they still had people,
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting to see their perspective on that. I'm actually related to two of the victims. Let me make sure I have the name. It's Lauren Wagner and Jane King. On my mom's side, were actually victims of the Hillside Stranglers that we were related to.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And today in my psychology class, we were talking about how much your brain just affects everything. Like, people use the quote a lot, perception becomes reality. But that's totally true. Like, I don't think when Angelo and Kenneth were little boys, like, that was their reality. They probably weren't thinking about murder, but as they grow up, you know, if something went wrong. And even the not necessarily the desire, but that's what I'm going to call it, the desire to twist your reality around to say, oh, I have multiple personality disorder, when so many other serial killers do. Like, you take Bundy, for example, was seen as a charismatic guy, but in reality he had social anxiety and a lot of other personality disorders that caused his reality to be something completely different. He could put on that face to abduct women, but after that he couldn't, he became anxious. I have a case here that I think is just crazy and just shows how much, like, your brain can play into, your psychology can play into murders. This is an article written by Florida Ian and Lynn Ian, and this is a case of a mom in Texas who suffered from postpartum depression and ended up drowning her 5 children. And it was kind of a known thing. She had come very forward about her postpartum depression, and it was really interesting to see how they compared this case to cases maybe that weren't in the United States. For example, they compare it to in the United Kingdom, they have an act called the, I hope I say this right, because if not, I'm going to feel really bad, Infanticide Act, which was released in 1922, and they say that the United States is really behind on this because like I was saying, he was trying, Kenneth was trying to change his charges from murder to manslaughter with the insanity, and this kind of does that for you. If you're a mom who just had a baby, your hormones have been able to provide for this baby for such a long time, and then at 9 months, it's gone. Like, what does your body do with that? Like, that surplus of hormones, I guess. And so in their article, they state that if the mother has not fully recovered from the effect of giving birth to such a child, by reason thereof the balance of her mind was then disturbed. And so I think this was a really interesting case, and she did get charged with all 5 cases of manslaughter, but I think it's very interesting that perception of things becomes your reality in your brain, that's something that you have to have, like Victoria called it, an addiction. And I think that addiction kind of blinded these killers into first being prostitutes that were, their bodies were disposed in very impersonal places. They were disposed not close to anybody on the highway, in the parks and stuff like that. But then it sort of escalated into in driveways close to people's homes, stuff like that.
Propped up. It's like on display. It's like, look at what I did.
It's horrible because, they say that murderers are, the reason they become serial killers is because they're always trying to chase the high from their first kill. And they say that also with a lot of drug users, is that the first high they experience is apparently like magical, and so that's why they continue using, because they're trying to reach that same feeling, but they always come short of that. And so I wonder if that like also has a lot to play in the part, is that they're trying to get that feeling but they just can't. And that's why they do, like, they dispose of like these people's bodies in the way they do, because they don't view them as successful.
I feel like here's a theory. So like Kenneth, he's like the younger one, and I feel like Angela was kind of like that mastermind. He's like the older cousin. He's like, I think he's like 20 years older than Kenneth. And Kenneth didn't really have like a father figure. I feel like Angela was like that father figure, and he wanted to like please him in a way. And because Angela was like, he was like the pimp. He had all the women. He had like the money from his upholstery shop. Like, he didn't have a whole lot. He was still kind of like a dirtbag, but like it was like pleasing somebody else. And then when he didn't have him in where was it, Washington. Like, kind of messed up, didn't do as good. But there's like, after Kenneth was in prison, this is just insane. So he got this like wife, kind of
Oh, yeah,
This is crazy, and it's so stupid.
Kelly Boyd, right?
Yeah. What he did
I
was
think
so
I-
dumb. It is ridiculously
Her
stupid.
pen pal.
Yeah. So they had this plan to, like, somehow make people think the Hillside Strangler was still out there. So he would, like, collect his semen. It's weird. And then he somehow smuggled it out to his wife. And she met up with some woman, tried to strangle her, but didn't succeed at all. And she was going to put the semen everywhere and make it look like...
He did it.
Yeah, but he's in jail. Like, even if... And they wanted people to think, like, the Hillside Strangler was still out there, even though it was his DNA, and he's in jail. I thought that was so silly.
That kind of connects perfectly to what I was going to talk about, which is like the Golden State Killer. And pretty recently, it was 2018 when he was arrested, but these murders and stuff took place in like the 70s and the 80s. And the whole reason that they were able to catch him was through like the whole DNA, like all those advances that we've made in that field. So just a little bit of background information on this case. He would break into people's homes and like completely ransack it, like tear it apart. And then like if there were couples there, he'd like tie them up, like blindfold them, and then he would rape the woman, and then in front of their like boyfriends or their husbands, and then he'd like shoot them, kill them, which is obviously very messed up. So he did that in like the 70s and the 80s, and then they kind of like tapered off. He lived in a couple different places, like Sacramento, like I think like LA area. So he moved around a little bit, and then like eventually he stopped killing people. But like they never found the killer, and like they didn't even know that some of these like murders and like break-ins, because at some houses like there wouldn't be anyone there, so he wouldn't kill anyone. He'd just break into their house and just completely mess up their house. Like it was pretty crazy. Like so the way that they described it, like he'd completely tear things off the walls. Like imagine you just walk home and it's just like
A mess.
completely torn
No, your
apart.
walls are torn apart. It's crazy.
So they were able to so first, like with all the advances that they made in like DNA processing, they were able to connect multiple murders and multiple break-ins from different locations and from like a couple of years apart all together to one person. So like, okay, now we know that it's this one guy doing it, but we don't know who's doing it.
Yeah.
And it was actually really interesting because it ties into like privacy and like the ethics of using like DNA tests to find people and like their criminal records.
Like with 23andMe and stuff. Because didn't he do that or something?
It was like a My Genealogy, like ancestry thing. And so like they were able to connect it to like a family member. And they're like,
Oh, that's
okay,
crazy.
like their DNA
And
is
you got
very
caught.
similar to this killer's. And then so from there, they went around and looked to the family members. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I watch a lot of Forensic Files with my mom, and that's like they always like if it's cold cases that they're now solved, it's all because of DNA technology or fingerprint technology that they didn't have.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
That's
it's
crazy.
Really interesting.
What
And
time can do.
Another interesting thing was like he was a police officer in multiple of like the places that he was living at. So like I think it was at least 2 or 3 times in like multiple cities where like he applied and like got jobs as a police officer, which is pretty interesting. Like you'd think the screening process and like literally being around people who are like trying to solve these cases, they would see him. But
That's really
they
interesting.
didn't.
They like to involve themselves in it.
Yeah.
Give themselves like power, I guess.
I feel like in some cases that's the best cover up, but at the same time it's like the worst.
Yeah.
Because if you say something, they're like, you know those scenes where they're like, for example, I was watching Harry Potter and and he was like, I didn't mention anything about a graveyard, and then from there you're like, oh
You're the
I
killer.
know it was
You're the
you.
killer.
It was you.
That's funny. I mean, anything else?
I got
Any
a
more facts?
I got a case. I
Let's
had a
hear
case
it.
that happened in New Mexico. To be specific, Truth or Consequences. This one was crazy. It was crazy. I had to refresh my memory, but it's the case of the toy box killer, and his name is David Parker Ray, and he is said to have possibly murdered over 50 women in New Mexico.
Wow.
Yeah. So to get into the details, I'm gonna just go over this one person, the lady who basically got him caught. Her name was Cynthia Vigil. And she was in a parking lot in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where this guy, which funny thing, was pretending to be a police officer and was like, I need you to come with me, whatever. So he gets her and he takes her to this like trailer park in Truth or Consequences, I guess you could call it. He had like this mini camper, and him and I believe his wife or accomplice, they say, Cindy Hendy, tied her and chained her to a table inside of this van and began to torture her, sexually assault her, basically use her as a slave. And they would put in cassette tapes and record what they were going to do. And this is where he basically said, like, she's like a slave, like, she only answers if she's spoken to, and this and that. And they would do god-awful things and take pictures of these horrible things that they're doing to this lady. And one day, Cindy Hendy, his accomplice, leaves the keys to the toy box in reach of Cynthia, and she takes her shot and books it. And the only thing that she has on is a collar, like with a chain connected to it, and she's naked, and she runs out the trailer park and knocks on this guy's door, and he takes her inside, and obviously the police get called and everything, and she tells him everything she knows. And the reason he gets caught is because of the tapes and the photographs, and the way that he had spoken on the tapes made them want to investigate more into the case, because they thought, they were like, the way he did this, there's no way it was his first time. And that's why they started finding all these victims, and it's said that he has over 50, and I believe he's still serving time. But it's just crazy to think about, because all these cases you hear about, like Ted Bundy and everybody, they live, of course, nowhere near us. And so whenever you hear about somebody with a mind so twisted to be able to torture someone like that in New Mexico, is just crazy. So yeah, that's what I wanted to touch on.
I think it's way interesting that you talked about, like, it's said over 50, like, because I think Ted Bundy's is still over whatever number. And I thought it was really interesting. My psych teacher actually shared this with me, that when Bundy was convicted and was in his interviews about how many women he killed, he would always start his sentences with, theoretically, if I were to kill so-and-so, their body would be here, and would give the officers or the interviewers the exact location of these bodies, but they weren't able to charge them with that crime until
it was
everything else happened. Until her body was examined, until all this stuff, because they couldn't use that as concrete evidence because of that theoretic, it wasn't a concrete sentence, it wasn't a concrete what would you call that, confession from him.
That's crazy.
And what's even worse about people who kill multiple people is that you will never, it's not just like one person and who is forever remembered. It's there's so many different people who you don't get to hear their stories, because you can read something or listen to something and hear X, Y, and Z was murdered like this, but to those victims, that was like a very real thing in their life that they had to experience and unfortunately pass away from. And it's like horrible that they don't all get to be remembered in their own way, because it happens so often.
I feel like that's one kind of bad thing about like the true crime like genre. Like, I feel like sometimes people will like glamorize
murder,
the killers and stuff. Like, these are horrible, awful people.
And, oh my god, I
Zac
love true
Efron
crime. I'm obsessed. I'm obsessed with true crime.
Not
it's like
Ted Bundy.
Well, you can be interested in true crime, but are you interested in it for the right reasons?
Yeah.
You're not romanticizing the killer.
Yeah,
That's true.
I think that's why so many people are interested in true crime, though, is that it's something so unusual and so morbid. Like, your brain really can't wrap around
like
being tortured. Like, why? Like, how?
Well,
how? Like,
because a lot of it has to do with like memory. You have never experienced being tortured, thankfully, so you don't know what it feels like, and you don't experience having the thoughts of wanting to kidnap someone.
It's easier to like disconnect from it.
So it's like you don't have those feelings and you don't have those thoughts, and so it's more like it's harder to understand why they want to do what they want to do.
it's more of a story than a real thing.
like, to be a serial killer, you have to be so like mentally disturbed.
Because
And most people don't understand that, so it's like hard to even relate, so it's easy to watch. You're just like, oh,
Listen,
okay,
like,
that's a story.
Yeah,
It's not
a guy could reject me, but that doesn't mean that I'm against guys forever and I want to
Yeah.
kill them.
Yeah.
Like, it's just people's brains work differently.
It's hard to relate. Anything else?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, thanks for watching, guys. Upod podcast on youmatter.com. Okay. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.